Okay. You know, looking back on how we did Daniel 11 last week, I think that if I had a chance, I would do it a different way next time. What I would probably do is I would take one meeting and just do an overview of the entire chapter and look at specific verses that are easier to understand than others, that point to the specific kingdoms that are found in Daniel's empire sequences. In other words, this verse seems to point to this power. This verse seems to point to this power. So you get an overview of the big picture, and then when you read through, you can fill in the cracks with specifics. Does that make sense? So you look at the forest as a whole, and then after that, once you understand the forest, then you can look at the trees. If that makes sense. So I think next time I do this, it'll be a little different than the way I'm doing it right now. But nevertheless, let's proceed and let's do a review of what we learned last week and what you were able to teach to others that you learned last week, right? Right, Goldine? All right. Remember, in verse 1, we discovered that Gabriel said, I strengthened Darius when he was in power. And if you go back to Daniel 10, verse 1, Daniel 11's vision, or Daniel 10, 11, and 12, really the whole textual unit, was given during the third year of the reign of Cyrus. And since Cyrus and Darius are Persian kings, we can assume then that the empire sequence of Daniel 11 begins with Persia, much like Daniel 8 began with Persia, right? So this tells us that we can begin our sequence with the Persian Empire. And of course, verse 2 finds Gabriel mentioning 4 Persian kings that would arise. And since Cyrus was in power when this vision was given, we can safely assume that those 4 kings would come after Cyrus, right? Does that make sense? They must arise subsequent to Cyrus. And history shows us that Cambyses came to power after Cyrus' death. And then you have Smerdis, Darius the First, which is a different Darius than the Darius in verse 1. And then you have Xerxes, the 4th king, which was more powerful than those preceding kings. And Xerxes actually warred specifically against the Greek Empire. And at the end of verse 2, the kingdom of Greece is mentioned because that's the kingdom that the 4th king, who we would identify as Xerxes, warred against. So you have Persia and Greece mentioned in those first few verses, which shows us that Persia and Greece are part of the empire sequence there, right? Then you have verse 3, which describes a mighty king, and since the kingdom of Greece was the last power mentioned in verse 2, the mighty king in verse 3 must come out of the Greek Empire. And this king would do according to his will. And this is a direct reference to Alexander the Great, the most powerful Greek king in Greek history, ancient Greek history, right? So are you with me on that so far, right? Then you have in verse 4, it discusses how Alexander's kingdom would be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. That is a clue into the 4-fold division of the Greek Empire after Alexander's death, right? We know that from history, right? And we know that his 4 generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, divided up the empire. And what's very interesting is when you look at the divisions of Seleucus and Ptolemy specifically, they are north and south of ancient Israel, geographically. So in that time of history, they were the kings of the north and the south. And remember, kings and kingdoms are synonymous in the book of Daniel. If you look at Daniel 7, Daniel uses synonymously kings and kingdoms. So we might call the king of the north the kingdom of the north, and the king of the south the kingdom of the south. But the point is that when you look at this 4-fold division, using ancient Israel as a geographic reference point, the Seleucid Syrian dynasty was north of Israel, and the Ptolemaic Egyptian dynasty was south of Israel. So in that day, the king of the north was the Seleucid Syrian dynasty, or the kingdom of the north, and the king or kingdom of the south was the Ptolemaic Egyptian dynasty. Okay, does that make sense? Pretty simple, right? Okay. Now in verse 5, we find the first mention of the king of the south. You don't see the king of the north mentioned, even though it's kind of implied. You don't see the king of the north mentioned until the next verse. But basically it says in verse 5, and the king of the south shall be strong. In other words, initially after Alexander died, the king or kingdom of the south, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was the strongest of the four empires. It was initially the strongest. And in fact, Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy I Soter, I believe his name is, right there on the screen, he ruled the longest of the initial kings over Alexander's four empires from his kingdom. Okay? And then it says that one of Alexander's princes would become strong above the king of the south. And later on, you see how the king of the north becomes stronger than the king of the south. And so we see the implication in verse 5 of the king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the south being the Ptolemaic dynasty and the king of the north being the Seleucid Antiochian dynasty. And those two kings, Ptolemy the first and Seleucus the first, were the two kings of those dynasties. The first kings of those dynastic empires. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Now, there was something else I was going to mention too that's important about this, but it escapes me right now. That's because I just turned 50. Let's see. What's that?
I said, you seem like you're kind of proud of that.
I don't. Well, yes and no. It's a badge of honor, and yet it's a struggle to work through. Okay. All right. So in verse 6, it says, "After some years, the king of the north and the king of the south will come together to make an alliance." And if you look at the Seleucid and Egyptian history and the relations between those two powers, there was such a time after the reign of those first two kings where those kings came together and made an alliance. And it was actually a marriage alliance between Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, and Antiochus II, Theos. They came together, and Ptolemy II gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II in a marriage alliance. And Antiochus was married to a lady named Laodice, and she had a couple of sons from Antiochus. Well, he put her away and married Berenice. But the verse goes on to say that Antiochus wouldn't stand, and neither would the woman that was with him or her posterity. And history shows that Laodice exacted revenge on Antiochus and Berenice by poisoning them to death. So that's described in verse 6. And see, what you need to do when it comes to some of these verses is you got to, because as I said, they're very terse in their details. They're very short and sweet and almost rough in their reading. And when it comes to attaching historical events, you just have to be very careful that you're within the frame of time that the text is describing, and then look for historical details that might fit these phrases in the verse. Because one of the challenges in Daniel 11 is, how do we really know that this historical event is mentioned in this verse? It's a challenge. Because when you look at Adventist interpreters all across the board, everybody, it seems, has a different opinion on what the verse is saying, right? So how do you know for sure? Well, you've got to be very careful when you do that. All right? That was one of the things I wanted to say, but there was something else. Now, in verses 7 through 9, we find a description of the response of the king of the south to this poisoning of the king of the north and the daughter that was given by the king of the south. Berenice was the daughter of Ptolemy. And when he found out that her life was in jeopardy and that she eventually was poisoned to death, he launched a war against the Seleucid dynasty. And this was done by Ptolemy III, Euergetes. To avenge the death of Berenice, he invaded Seleucid territory. He won vast amounts of Seleucid territory. And he even recaptured the Egyptian treasures taken by the Persians. And he did this against Seleucus II Callinicus. And the verse says that he continued more years. In other words, he lived longer than Seleucus II. Okay. So verses 7 to 9 describes this response by the king of the south against the king of the north's poisoning, and the daughter of the king of the south's poisoning. Okay. I think I've lost you, but I'm trying. All right, now, verses 10 to 13 discuss further relations between these two dynasties it discusses how the king of the south would win another victory against the king of the north who threatened him, but then the king of the north would regroup and then win another victory against the king of the south. There's a lot of back and forth going here between the north and the south. All right? So this verse, when you look at this phase of history, when did this happen? Well, in 217 BC, Ptolemy IV met Antiochus III in a battle at Raphia and won a decisive victory. But then Antiochus went home and regrouped for several years, building up an even stronger army. And then he met Ptolemy V in battle at a place called the Panium in 200 and defeated the Ptolemaic dynasty. And the Ptolemaic dynasty would be kicked out of Judah and Judea forever after that. Because the whole reason why these two kings warred against each other was because they had a continual border dispute over Israel, who was caught in between those two. Because back then, Judea was a very wealthy and rich and prosperous territory economically. It was close to the ocean. There were a lot of natural resources, timber and these types of things. And these two powers saw the value of holding that territory. All right? And God's covenant people happened to be there, located there. So they fought basically back and forth for control of that area. Okay? So here, when Antiochus III won this victory over Ptolemy V, basically the Egyptian dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, never was a factor again in the affairs of Judah. Okay? All right, so then in verses 14 through 16, we find how the king of the north would attack the king of the south in several ways and build siege mounds and all these types of things. Well, this describes how Antiochus IV, who is the king of the north from the Seleucid dynasty, invaded Egypt and even took control of Jerusalem. Yet in verse 16, we find another power that comes into play against Syria who does according to his own will, and that is Rome. So Rome comes into the vision here in verse 16 and kicks the Seleucid dynasty out of Egypt, because as I told you last week, Egypt was Rome's breadbasket, and you don't want anybody messing with your food supply. Okay? So they kicked Rome out of Egypt, and Antiochus was basically, under the threat of intimidation, forced to retreat back to Syria. And on the way back to Syria, he stopped by Jerusalem, because when Judea heard that Rome was in Egypt against Antiochus, they revolted against Antiochus's rule. And Antiochus went to Jerusalem, and he slaughtered thousands of Jews. He desecrated the temple. He didn't destroy the temple or level the city, but he slaughtered a lot of Jews, and then he defiled the sanctuary with a pig's head and all that stuff. You probably heard that history. But Rome eventually defeated the Seleucid dynasty when Pompey the Great, a Roman general, invaded the east and basically took control of that region. And in 64 BC, he ended the Seleucid dynasty, and in 63 BC, he also conquered Jerusalem. He didn't level the city, he didn't burn the temple to the ground, but he took over the city in behalf of Rome. So he did according to his will. And verse 16 says that Rome would stand in the glorious land and consume the glorious land. Well, the glorious land's Israel, right? It's a symbol that describes Israel, all right? And Rome stood in the glorious land and consumed it when Pompey the Great took over Judea, basically in 63 BC. Now, what's interesting about this is because Rome conquered Syria and took control of the area where God's covenant people were located, guess what? It becomes the next king of the north in the narrative. Because what makes the king of the north is the king of the north assumes God's prerogatives. It controls God's covenant people, it persecutes God's covenant people, and it controls the conscience of God's covenant people. The Seleucids tried to do it, and then when their power ended, Rome stepped in and took that position and then becomes the next king of the north in Daniel 11. So the first king of the north was the Seleucid Antiochian dynasty. The next king of the north is now Imperial Rome. Okay, does that make sense? All right. And again, in verse 16, it does according to its will. Like Alexander did, this power would do according to its will, which means that it would have its way. All right. Now, in verses 17, 18, and 19, we find a description of Imperial Roman history, but the details of those three verses better fit the career of Caesar, Remember, the he's and hims and hises of Daniel 11, they describe empires and specific rulers within those empires in the first 29 verses of the chapter. And we're going to see tonight that verses 30 and 31 signify a shift, an interpretive hermeneutical shift in how we are to understand Daniel 11 from that point forward. But in the first 29 verses, empires and then specific rulers in those empires simultaneously. And in verses 17, 18, and 19, it talks about how Rome would conquer the coastlands and how the daughter of women would be corrupted, and but she would not stand for him, and he would stumble and fall and not be found. Well, this is a description of Julius Caesar, his conquests around the Mediterranean, how he defiled Cleopatra VII through his affair with her because he was 30 or 40 years her senior. And yet she couldn't prevent him from stumbling and falling, which means Caesar was eventually assassinated by a senatorial conspiracy in 44 BC. Okay? So this is that, and it says that in verse 19, by the way. Okay? Then you have a raiser of taxes or an imposer of taxes standing in Caesar's estate. Well, Luke 2 verse 1 calls Caesar Augustus the raiser of taxes, right? He taxed Judea when Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem when she was pregnant with Jesus, right? So this describes Caesar Augustus, who arose in Julius Caesar's place, and he died a natural death, neither in anger nor in battle, the verse says. Augustus died a natural death. Then a vile person stood up in Augustus' estate. This was his stepson, successor, Tiberius Caesar, who arose as peacefully as his chosen successor. And then it talks about how Tiberius tightened his control over God's people, and then eventually the Prince of the Covenant was broken. Now the Prince of the Covenant is Christ, right? And Tiberius was the emperor in power when Christ was crucified, right? So verse 22 talks about the Prince of the Covenant being crucified. So basically what we have here is we have Persia, we have Greece, we have the four kingdoms, and more specifically a warfare between two of those four kingdoms, and then we have Imperial Rome. So we're faithful and holding to the chronological sequence that we see in Daniel's other visions so far, if that makes sense, right? Even though there's a lot of details here. All right, so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at verses 23 to 39. We're going to try to get through 16 verses. You think we can do it and understand it? Okay. All right. So a summary of 1 through 22, Daniel 1 and 2, Medo-Persia, 4 kings, 11, 2 and 3, Greece, Alexander the Great, Daniel 4, 4 Greek empires divided toward the four winds of heaven, Daniel 5 to 15, Syria, the king of the north versus Egypt, the king of the south, and then 16 to 22, we have Imperial Rome, who is now the next king of the north. Then we have a specific mention of the careers of Pompey, Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, and Christ. Make sense? Okay. Let's just go to Daniel 12 tonight. What do you think, folks? You want to just skip one? All right. Now, let's talk about, let's do an overview of 23 to 39, because this passage contains two sub-passages that are very controversial in Adventism. Okay? So there are two controversial texts in verses 23 to 39. One is verses 23 to 29, the first 6 verses. And the question is, does this text discuss Imperial Rome, or does it discuss Papal Rome and its crusades against Islam? When you look at Adventist interpreters on this verse, 23 to 29, you got two basic positions. Some believe that this text continues in its discussion of Roman history, Imperial Roman history, and others believe there's a transference into the medieval papacy and the crusades against Islam. Okay? So that's one controversial text. The other one is verses 36 to 39. You see, verses 30 to 35, there's no question on. Everybody's nearly in harmony with those middle 5 or 6 verses. But these last verses, 36 to 39, here's where a major interpretive divide takes place. Because how you interpret 36 to 39 affects how you interpret 40 to 45. Does this text discuss Papal Rome, or atheistic France. Those who see it being a discussion of the papacy see the papacy as the king of the north in Daniel 11:40, and then verses 41 to 45 describes end-time activities that the papacy perpetrates. But those who see a shift to atheistic France see the king of the north as Turkey in verse 40, the king of the south as literal Egypt in verse 40, and another power called the Him, which is Napoleonic France and Napoleon in verse 40, and then they see the subsequent verses there describing Napoleonic history, with the exception of verse 45, which is still seen as future, and understood to mean that there will be a Turkish capital move from Istanbul to Jerusalem. Okay? So these verses are very important to understand because they affect how we're going to interpret the most important verses in Daniel 11, which are the last 6 verses, which are for the most part, I'm going to argue, still future in terms of fulfillment. Did I lose you?
But
Okay.
But the Turkey part is way out of the norm of the
Well,
history of
That's what I'm going to suggest, even though I have some very good friends who believe in this view, and we're in a dialogue about it. But one of my biggest points that would suggest that Turkey's probably not the right way to go is that it does violate the sequential arrangement of Daniel's earlier visions, and I'm arguing that Daniel, and this is what I argued in my master's thesis, that 10, 11, and 12 follow suit. They don't deviate significantly. Now, you might suggest that the Seleucids and Ptolemies earlier in Daniel 11 is a deviation because those wars aren't mentioned in earlier apocalypses. But one thing you have to remember is they still fall under the umbrella of the 4 kingdoms. There's still 2 of the 4 Greek kingdoms that were divided after Alexander's death. So I think we're in a safe area there because you're still discussing that history. You're not going off into a different vein of history that's not really related, if that makes sense. Yeah, so, but let's talk it through though, because I don't want to be so dogmatic, but I do think there's some pretty solid evidence to suggest that Turkey's probably not the way to go. And I think, and when you understand the history of Uriah Smith and James White and some of these other things, there's some interesting points there that we may or may not have time to get into. But so the question we're gonna resolve tonight, hopefully, is who is discussed in this verse and who is discussed in this verse. Okay? And I'm just going to tell you up front, I believe that these verses discuss imperial Rome because there's no transference, there's no evidence in verse 23 that there's a transference into a new power. It's a continuation of the discussion of the power in the previous verses. And the same thing is true in verse 36. There's no evidence to suggest that Daniel 11 is shifting into a new description of another power. It seems to show the language of being a continued discussion of the power that it discussed in the previous verses. So I'm going to argue that imperial Rome is discussed here and papal Rome is discussed here. And I'm going to show you why I believe that. Okay? All right, so let's look at verses 23 and 24. Now remember, we've just left off with the breaking of the Prince of the Covenant at the end of verse 22. So we've just left off with the crucifixion of Christ. Okay? All right, so Daniel 11, as I put my bifocals on here. All right, let me get there. Daniel 11. Okay. Now I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version. Okay, so in verse 22 it says, "With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the Prince of the Covenant." So there's the breaking of the Prince of the Covenant. That's the crucifixion of Christ, right? Now notice what it says in verse 23. It says, "And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully." Now does that appear to transition into a new empire? Or does it appear to be just a continued discussion of the same empire? Right? So evidently we're still in imperial Rome. So it says, "And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people." Now, the question is what is the league? Who are the small people? And what does it mean to become strong with the small people? Well, since God's covenant people at this time in history were the Jews and the Jewish nation, I believe the small people is the Jewish nation. And this league is evidently a league that Rome entered into with the Jewish nation. and eventually used that league to intervene more and more directly into the affairs of the Jewish people to where at some point they would destroy them. Does that make sense? So if we read it again, it says, and after the league is made with him, in other words, after the Jewish league is made between Rome and the Jews, he shall act deceitfully, meaning Rome would use that league and manipulate that alliance to put a stranglehold on God's people and eventually destroy the glorious land. Okay? And then it says, for he shall come up and become strong with a small people, in the King James, or a small number of people. So this league would be used by imperial Rome to subjugate the Jewish people. John?
But your verse 22 ends in AD 31.
Right.
So this is verse 23 is occurring before AD 34.
Well, the league was initiated in 161 BC by the Maccabees, but Jerusalem wasn't destroyed until AD 70.
Correct.
Because I'm going to argue that verse 24 describes the destruction of Jerusalem. And by the way, both Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus renewed that covenant with the Jews. They re-ratified that treaty and alliance with the Jewish nation. And if I remember correctly, and I'd have to check my history on this, but every Roman leader and emperor, whenever they would come to power, would re-ratify treaties and alliances with their allies, if that makes sense.
Correct.
Go ahead.
But if we're talking about Daniel and these kingdoms having
It wouldn't make sense to go back in time, right?
Interaction with God's people is now changing from the Jews to the Christians.
Right. Not quite, but yeah, we're getting there in here. Yeah.
So that's like your...
I think you have to remember there is some overlap here a little bit, if that makes sense. But hopefully it'll get clear. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. All right. Now it says in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, the spoil, and the riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. Now, what does this mean? Okay, so in verse 23, and again, let's just assume, John, that I'm on the right track here, okay? Rome uses this league to control Judea, the glorious land, right? And eventually destroy it at some point. And in verse 24 it says, he shall enter peaceably even to the richest places of the province. In my opinion, peaceably means that Rome would use this treaty to tighten its control over the geographic glorious land, right? And then, which basically are the richest places of the province, as I said, Judea was a very rich land economically. And he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. Now, I take that to mean that evidently Rome, in its conquest of the glorious land, would bring that glorious land into subjection, but it would be done in such a way as has not been done by past Roman leaders and past conquerors who conquered Jerusalem. Remember, I told you when Alexander conquered Jerusalem or took over Jerusalem, he left it intact. When Pompey took over Jerusalem, he left it intact. Even when Antiochus Epiphanes conquered Jerusalem and desecrated the temple, he still left it intact. He didn't burn the temple, he didn't destroy the city. He killed some Jews and he desecrated. But my point is that evidently imperial Rome would conquer the glorious land and do what has not been done by past conquerors, forefathers and fathers, by leveling the city and razing it to the ground. In past conquests of Jerusalem, the temple and the city were left intact. But evidently a destruction is going to take place that will be to the level to where it will be wiped off the map, basically. And that's what Titus did in AD 70. He burnt the temple to the ground. He razed the city to the ground. He took thousands of Jews into captivity and slavery, and he slaughtered hundreds of thousands of more Jews in this battle for Jerusalem. So I believe that this verse here is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and how Rome would use this past league with the Jewish nation that it ratified years before, and it would use that, and gradually as Rome transitioned into an imperial power through its emperors, it would tighten its control on Judea until it eventually would level it and wipe it off the map.
Now, where does the Maccabees come into this picture?
Well, the Maccabees actually initiated this initial league because they rose up in rebellion against Seleucid rule. And they appealed to Rome and said, listen, we've got this idiot Seleucid kingdom here trying to conquer us. Can you come help us against this? Because this is a war for independence for us. And Rome said, yes, we will come and help you.
But did the Maccabees fight against Rome?
They did, eventually. Yep. Once the Seleucid dynasty was over, they did fight against Rome too. And again, that was another reason for Judea, for Rome to come in and continue to tighten its control of Judea, because Judea was a problematic province for Rome. They kept rebelling and kept causing problems and rising up against Roman rule until eventually they came in, and Titus came in and did what his fathers and forefathers didn't do. He leveled the place. All right? And then it goes on to say, he shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. This was done by Titus. Titus dispersed among the empire all these Jewish captives. He took the temple vessels back to Rome. You've seen those arches and artifacts that show the candlesticks being carried back to Rome and all the temple furniture and all that, right? And he dispersed the plunder all throughout the empire. Okay? And then it says, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. Now, this is a debated phrase, and I'm going to give you my version of what I think it means. The he here is not just Titus, it's Imperial Rome. And Imperial Rome would devise plans against all rival empires around the Mediterranean that threatened its rule. And Rome, the city itself, would be an imperial center from which Rome would plan the conquest of all rival kingdoms. In other words, Rome would plot out the destruction of all rivals to its power from the city and conquer everything that challenged its rule. And it would do this for a time. Now, how do we understand the time? Okay, and how many days are in a biblical year? 360, and what's a day equal in prophecy? Nope. Close, though. What is a day equal in prophecy? So 360 prophetic days of a time is what? 360 years. So evidently there would be a 360-year period from which Rome would be an imperialistic power that would conquer all rivals. And by the way, most Adventist interpreters agree with this interpretation. They see this as a 360-year period. And with any time prophecy, what do you need? You need two things. What do you need? A starting point and an ending point. So where do we get a starting point and an ending point for this? Well, 25 verses 25 to 29, I believe, provides that. Okay? Now, let me unpack this. Again, there's no evidence in verse 23 to suggest a transfer into the history of medieval papal Rome. Therefore, verse 23 continues in a discussion of the power discussed in verse 22, which is Imperial Rome. The League in verse 23 discusses an alliance between a small people, the Jewish nation, and Imperial Rome. This alliance was initiated in 161 BC and was eventually later used by Rome to destroy Judea. Okay? This destruction would take place when the future Roman Emperor Titus, and Titus ruled after Tiberius. From verse 22, under whose reign the Prince of the Covenant was destroyed, or broken. So Titus, who reigned actually from AD 79 to 81, and his Roman armies destroyed the city of Jerusalem and its temple in AD 70. And remember, Daniel 9, 26 and 27 talks about that. All right? Now, earlier conquests of Judea did not involve a total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Yet Titus did that which his conquering Roman fathers and fathers' did not do. He destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Okay? Imperial Rome would also devise his plans against the strongholds by plotting the destruction of all rivals to its power by conquering many territories. All right? The city of Rome would be the imperial center from which the Roman Empire planned the conquest of all Mediterranean rivals to its power in a military sense. All right? And this military agenda of imperialistic conquest would take place for a time, or for 360 literal years. Okay?
Where did Rome originate from in the beginning? Because it seemed like this came out on the scene.
Well, if you study Roman history, there are a lot of myths involved with the origin of Rome. One myth is that a man named Aeneas fled the city of Troy when King Agamemnon of Mycenae in the Greek city-states led the assault on the city of Troy, which the movie Troy is based on. Of course, the movie Troy is a horrific butchering of history. Okay? The point is, though, is that Aeneas escaped the city of Troy and fled westward and founded the city of Rome on the Tiber River. Another legend talks about two twins named Romulus and Remus who were fed by a she-wolf, nursed from the paps of the she-wolf, and then founded the city of Rome. And none of those myths coordinate with each other. There's all kinds of different historical foundings. But in my guess, I think that, like many city-states, groups of families just banded together for protection against raiders and pillagers and attacking groups. Rome was situated near Ostia, which is a port off western Italy. So it was situated in a good place. It was on the Tiber River. It had several hills, and it initially was a swamp that was drained. And these families got together for religious purposes and for military purposes, and eventually it just grew in strength. And a lot of Rome's wars were defensive in nature because they were attacked from without. And they grew strong just for purposes of self-preservation. And then eventually, when they fought Greece, they eventually started saying, well, you know what, instead of waiting for powers to come attack us, let's do preemptive strikes on powers before they get too strong and take them out ahead of time. And that way we won't have to worry about them later. And eventually that developed. But that's the best that I know about Rome right here, just off the top of my head. Does that help you at all? So if you're on Jeopardy and Alex Trebek asks you about the she-wolves and Romulus and Remus, you'll be ready. I'll take Roman history for 500, Alex. All right. So the question now becomes, how do we understand this 360-year period from which the city of Rome would be a center of conquest? Okay. Well, verses 25 to 28 provides the starting point for this 360-year period, while verse 29 will provide its ending point. And I'm going to suggest to you that these verses lay the foundation for understanding verses 30 and 31 in a beautiful way. Okay? So, these verses, 25 to 29, will also provide a basis for understanding verses 30 to 31. Okay? Verses 20 to 29 discusses the second north-south conflict in Daniel 11. Like the first north-south conflict in verses 5 to 15, this second conflict concludes with the king of the north gaining victory over the king of the south. Here's what I wanted to remember earlier, Goldine. There are 3 north-south conflicts in Daniel 11. Verses 5 to 15, 25 to 29, and verse 40. And in every one of those north-south conflicts, the king of the north emerges victorious over the south. Now, some people see in verse 40 a 3-way war between north and south and the king of verse 36 of Daniel 11. I'm going to talk about that more. But as I look at the earlier 2 north-south conflicts, there's only 2 powers involved, north and south. So it would make sense that that third north-south conflict in verse 40 only involves north and south too, and not a third power. And we're going to come to that in our next. Well, good question. Because where are we in history right now? We're in Roman history. Okay? But the question is where? All right? So let's talk about that, because that's a relevant question. Who is the southern power right now at this stage in the narrative? Well, let's talk about it. Let's read verses 25 to 28. So after devising plans against the strongholds, but only for a time, it says in verse 25, he, this is imperial Rome, shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So the king of the north will come against the king of the south with a strong army. The king of the south will respond, but he won't be successful. Right? And then in verse 26 it says, yes, those who eat a portion of his, the south's, delicacies shall destroy him, the south. The south's army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So eventually the king of the south will be destroyed. All right? Verse 27, both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will be at the appointed time. So evidently, during this period of warfare, the two kings come together at the table and try to make peace, but in reality, they've got evil plans against each other. And the end will come at the appointed time. And then it says in verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so shall he do damage and return to his own land. And so this is in reference to the he of verse 25, which is the king of the north. The king of the south gets wiped out in this second conflict, and then the king of the north in verse 28 returns to his own land with great riches, and then his heart is moved against the holy covenant. Right? So what does all this mean? What we need to do, what empire, who's the main empire in control in this text? Rome. Imperial Rome, right? So what we need to do now, and who's the king of the south? We see no transference into another power as the king of the south. So the king of the south must still be Ptolemaic Egypt, the last remaining kingdom of Alexander's empire to be conquered by Rome. Remember, we're looking for starting and ending points of the 360-year prophecy at the end of verse 24. So we now must identify a time in Roman history when Rome fought against Egypt and conquered it. Do you know when that was? That was Octavian, who later became Caesar Augustus, versus Mark Antony, who aligned. After Caesar died, Caesar's Cleopatra, Antony stepped in and took her. And in fact, Octavian, after the death of Caesar, Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus formed the second triumvirate. Okay? The first triumvirate was Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. They divided the empire between the three of them earlier. Eventually, Crassus was killed in a battle against the Parthians, and Pompey and Caesar, their relationship degenerated to where they both fought for control of the empire, and eventually Pompey was defeated by Caesar at Pharsalus in 48 BC, and then was executed when he retreated to Egypt. Well, later on, after Mark Antony and Octavian hunted down Brutus and Cassius and all the killers of Caesar and executed them, they formed an alliance and brought in Marcus Lepidus. They gave Marcus Lepidus North Africa. Antony took the eastern half of the empire, and Octavian took Western Europe. So they divided the empire into three spots. Well, eventually Lepidus retired and said, I don't want any of this, I'm going into my retirement. So basically it came down to Octavian and Antony. And so Antony's alliance with Cleopatra in Egypt qualifies him as a representative of the kingdom of the south in this text. And we're going to see that this conflict between Octavian and Antony forms the starting point of the 360-year prophecy, because once Rome conquered the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last empire of Alexander's kingdom, no other powers really challenged its authority for a long time. And it could be free to basically perform its imperialistic plans of conquest from Rome as the center. Does that make sense? I think one of you understand what I'm saying. I think the rest of you maybe
Now,
not.
Egypt has
Not yet. Not yet. Okay? Now, just bear with me. First of all, there's no evidence in this text of a transference to other powers for the north and south. There's no evidence in these verses to suggest transference from one kingdom to the next for either north or south. So the north, we must conclude the king of the north is still imperial Rome, and the king of the south is still Ptolemaic Egypt, the final empire of Alexander's former kingdom to be conquered by Rome. Now, John, just so you know, because I've wrestled through this question of why, when we're at a certain point in history, do you have to go back? There are times, and I'm not justifying this necessarily, but there are times when Hebrew writers will go forward, and then they'll go back and overlap and go further down, and go back and overlap and go further down. You see Revelations written like that. Yeah. So I think there are times when there are little rewinds, but then it takes the point further when it gets to the end of the point. Does that make sense? It's kind of cycling through history.
Totally linear.
It's not completely linear, is it? But it is generally, but with cycles and repeats. Yeah. Okay. That's what I was trying to say earlier, and it took me about 15 minutes before I actually thought of the right way to say it. So in this text, you have the king of the north being Rome and Egypt being the king of the south. So we must discover a time in Roman history when imperial Rome conquered Ptolemaic Egypt. All right? Now, after Octavian, later Caesar Augustus, and Marcus Antonius or Mark Antony hunted down and killed Caesar's murderers, they eventually fought each other for control of the Roman Empire. The Roman Senate sided with Octavian, who represents imperial Rome as the king of the north. The Roman Senate hated Mark Antony because they felt he was a philanderer and a womanizer, and he wanted Egypt just so he could go hang out with Cleopatra and enjoy, live high on the hog and travel up and down the Nile in a Roman version of a cruise ship and enjoy all his time. And they looked at Antony with disdain, and they were like, this guy does not represent our values. But Octavian was a very conservative, politically conservative, religiously conservative man who they felt rightly represented Roman values, so to speak. Okay? So they said, you know what, Octavian? We're not too crazy about you because you're Caesar's offspring, but when we look at the other option, we like you better than him. So please represent us, basically, is the gist of what they said. Now, due to his alliance with Cleopatra of Egypt, Antony represents the Ptolemaic king of the south. Okay? Now, the two often spoke lies at one table, pretending to put away their differences, but each secretly plotted for sole control of the Roman Empire. There were times when Octavian and Antony would get together and make this illusion of peace, but deep down in their hearts, they're like, you know what, I'm going to take this guy out the first chance I get, and I'm taking over the empire myself. I don't want to share it with anybody. All right? Octavian eventually defeated Antony in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. After that battle, what happened in that battle was, this was off the western coast of Greece. It was a naval battle where Octavian and his best schoolmate Agrippa, who Paul later appealed to in Acts, they amassed this large Roman navy, and they met Antony's navy off the coast of Actium. And Cleopatra provided some ships, but when she saw that Octavian was probably going to beat Antony, she withdrew her ships and went back to Egypt and left Antony hanging. And Antony's battle, his forces were routed. He retreated back to Egypt, and when he found out Cleopatra was courting Octavian, he's like, you know what, I'm done. And he took his own life, and then Cleopatra committed suicide too. They both committed suicide. So by the time Octavian got to Egypt, they were dead, and he basically ended the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay. So Octavian eventually defeated Antony in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. After the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC, Octavian ended the Ptolemaic dynasty, and he also captured the Ptolemaic treasure, which made him the richest person in the entire world. He captured the Ptolemaic treasure, which was worth, probably by today's equivalents, billions of dollars. He became the richest man in the world, personally. And that's why this text says right here in verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, right? I believe this is a description of how Octavian, after conquering the Ptolemaic dynasty, became the wealthiest man on the planet in his day, right?
But he went back to Rome, right?
Yes.
With his riches.
Exactly. Yep. Now, It also says that his heart would be set against the Holy Covenant. Octavian really didn't launch any direct campaigns against Christians or even Judea, for that matter, even Israel. But there were later emperors that persecuted Christians and launched major waves of persecution against the Christian faith. So I'm thinking that this might be a general statement that talks about how several Roman emperors, who were kings of the north, right, representing Imperial Rome, who persecuted Christians. Okay? So Imperial Rome also persecuted Christians. His heart is set against the Holy Covenant. Persecutions against Christians took place during the reigns of several Roman emperors up until Constantine. And some emperors include, let's see, you've got Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Then you've got the year of the four emperors, Otto, Vitellius. There's one other emperor in that year. And then Vespasian, Titus's father, came to power in 69 and ruled until 79. Then Titus, 79 to 81. And then Domitian, I think, ruled from 81 to 94. And he's the one that sent John to Patmos. And then you've got, after Domitian, let's see, who came after Domitian? There's one more emperor that came after Domitian. Then you have Trajan and Hadrian. And then when you get into the 3rd century, you've got emperors like Decius and some of these guys that just launched vicious, violent persecutions against Christians. Diocletian was just before Constantine, and he launched the last persecution against the Christian faith.
What about Nero?
Nero was one of those too. Yeah, there's like 6 or 8 emperors that were especially violent against not just Judea, but the Christian faith as well. So, go ahead.
Well, previously you said they were seeking to destroy and control all of these groups around the Mediterranean. The quick rise of Christians pointed to some trouble.
Absolutely.
Old trouble.
Yeah.
In Rome, in their thing. I mean, this.
Yeah.
With thousands of converts in a day, I mean, you know,
Yeah.
Rome would sit up and take notice of who are these people? What?
Right. Even Nero's own household. A lot of people were converting to Christianity because of Paul's presence. I mean, Paul, everything he touched turned to a baptism and convert, man. Didn't just turn to gold, it turned to spiritual gold. I mean, he was, just winning souls. And even in Nero's household, people were converting to Christianity, which caused him to take alarm. And then that's when he set fire to the city and blamed it on the Christians. And then it all went downhill from there. But there were several Roman emperors in the first couple of centuries that Rome was ruling that launched persecutions against Christians. And keep in mind, when in this stage of the narrative, when you're dealing with the Holy Covenant in the glorious land, there's some overlap between the literal geographic glorious land of Israel, God's covenant people, and also this transition into the church as the new covenant people of God. So there's some transitioning going on here between who are God's covenant people, right? Because the covenant transferred from Israel to the church, right? We are the new Israel now, right? So there's some of that going on. Now, this leads us to the important point, though, is what is the starting point of the 360 years? Well, the starting point of the 360-year prophecy is 31 BC, when Octavian conquered Ptolemaic Egypt, which lands on an ending point of AD 330. If you go 360 years from BC 31, and remember, from BC to AD, you take out the year 0. So it's not 331, it's 330, right? This is this 360-year period. And so the question now becomes, what took place in AD 330 that ended the city of Rome's position as an imperial center of the empire? Well, let's look at verse 29. All right. Okay. At the appointed time, what appointed time is that? The end of the 360 years of verse 24, right? He, the imperial Roman king of the north, shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. So at the end of the 360 years, Rome would move toward the south, but not to the south of Egypt. And in that move toward Egypt, it wouldn't be like the first move, which was for purposes of war, verses 5 to 15, when the north conquered the south. And it won't be like the latter time in verse 40, when the north conquers the south again. It would be a peaceful move toward the south, but not to the south. So the question now becomes, what move took place in AD 330 that was toward Egypt, but not to Egypt, that began to remove the city of Rome's position as an imperial center? Remember, at the end of verse 24 it says, He, Rome, will forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time, meaning that Rome would be an imperial center from which all imperialistic designs would be perpetrated in conquering rivals to power. So when did that shift away from Rome take place? Okay, you know what it is, Brian, right? Okay, so the phrase at the appointed time refers to the end of the 360-year period in verse 24. The he refers to the imperial Roman king of the north who would go toward the south of Egypt but not to Egypt. This move would not be for war or conquest, as with the former move, verses 5 to 15, when the north conquered the south during the Seleucid Ptolemaic era. And it won't be similar to the latter move, because we're going to discover in verse 40 that the king of the north conquers the king of the south again in verse 40. So this move would be a peaceful one, right? So what happened in AD 330 that constitutes an imperial Roman move toward the south? Well, Brian, go ahead. Constantine founded a new imperial capital at Constantinople. And geographically, it's a move toward Egypt in the sense that it's closer mileage-wise to Egypt in terms of land travel. And what that did was that we cannot underestimate the significance of that, because what happened was when this new capital was designated, old Rome began a gradual demise in prosperity and in popularity, to where eventually the Western Empire and Rome itself would collapse and be overcome, which then in turn prepared the way for the papacy to come to power. And by the way, it's interesting that Constantine is the first quote-unquote Catholic emperor, which prepared the way for the rise of the papal power. Isn't that powerful? How come you guys aren't jumping out of your seats right now? All right? I'm excited about this. Now look, all right, let's look at this now. Goldine's like, we're just learning about this. Give us a chance to take it in a little bit, okay? All right, in AD 330, the Emperor Constantine, who reigned from 305 to 337, dedicated the city of Constantinople as the New Rome. He called it the New Rome, which was a move toward Egypt, but not to Egypt in a geographic sense. Okay? It's an ending to the 360 years, right? This establishment of a new imperial capital began the process of where old Rome declined as an imperial center. Constantinople would become the new imperial center of the empire. And by the way, the Eastern Empire still considered itself Roman. Justinian considered himself a Roman emperor. And Belisarius, his general that went and destroyed the Vandals and the Ostrogoths in the 6th century, he considered himself a Roman general. And in fact, there's a book out called The Last Great Roman General, Count Belisarius. I have a copy of that book in my library. So just because there was a geographic relocation of the imperial center to another city outside of Rome doesn't mean it ceased to be Roman. Still was Roman for all intents and purposes, okay? Huh? It was in Turkey, which is interesting, right? Yeah, I know, you're right. The dedication of Constantinople was a crucial event in Roman history because it was a key step in hastening the demise of the Western Roman Empire, and thus helped to prepare the way for the rise of the medieval papacy to power in Rome and Western Europe, which is actually described in verses 30 to 31, right after verse 29.
Okay, now.
That make sense?
On the map, where is Constantinople?
It's east of Rome.
It's Istanbul now.
It's Istanbul now, yes. It's east of Rome, but it's closer to Egypt than Rome is, geographically, according to land travel. because they traveled mostly by land a lot of times. Of course, they had ships in the Mediterranean. They could travel by sea. But in terms of land travel, it was a move toward Egypt, but not to Egypt, as the text says. Okay? So the 360-year prophecy of Daniel 11:24 extended from 31 BC, which is described in Daniel 11:25 to 28, to AD 330, which is described in Daniel 11:29. Okay? Man, we still have 10 verses to go. I'm not sure if we should keep going or not.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm sorry.
I'll tell you what, let's look at verses 30 and 31 and see where we're at, okay? All right. So let's read verses 30 and 31. It says, for ships from Cyprus, or Shittim in the King James, shall come against him, the king of the north, the imperial Roman king of the north. Therefore he shall be grieved. Okay? That's an interesting phrase. And return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So now what we see here is we see that the ships of Cyprus come against imperial Rome. And that move against imperial Rome causes Rome to be grieved. And then Rome returns. And then once it returns, it attacks the Holy Covenant. In other words, it persecutes Christians. Okay? So the question is who are the ships of Cyprus? What does it mean for Rome to be grieved? And what does it mean for Rome to return? All right? Well, I'm going to pose something to you here. It's important to note that verses 30 to 31 constitute a transitional text into the history of medieval papal Rome. Okay? Verse 30 states that the ships of Cyprus will come against him, imperial Rome. All right? This phrase implies that imperial Rome would be attacked and be grieved to the point of collapse. In other words, sometime after AD 330, imperial Rome would be attacked and collapse or lose power. Okay? History shows that Germanic tribal nations pushed across Roman European borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers in the 4th and 5th centuries and eventually swallowed up the empire. All right? When Constantine shifted everything east, Rome gradually weakened over time to where all these Germanic nations just swallowed it up and caused it to collapse. Right? All right? And what's interesting, with respect to the ships of Cyprus, this is a debated phrase because the SDA Bible Commentary states that some see that phrase as describing these Germanic nations that caused the collapse of the empire, especially the Vandal naval empire, which sacked the city of Rome in AD 455. So those could be the ships of Cyprus, the Vandals, the naval empire of the Vandals. Okay? The Western Roman Empire finally collapsed. It was grieved in AD 476 when the last emperor was deposed and a Heraclean king took over Italy. Okay? So the ships of Cyprus would come against Rome. Rome would be grieved by collapsing, but then it would return to power. Okay? Yet after being grieved, losing power, Rome would return to power and war against the Holy Covenant, i.e. work against the Christian faith through persecution. This took place when Rome collapsed in its imperial phase, grieved, in AD 476. It emerged in its papal phase by 538. So Rome would be grieved and collapse in its imperial phase, but then return to power in its papal phase by 538. So I think we see a transition here from imperial Rome to papal Rome. Now, papal Rome becomes the next manifestation of the king of the north in Daniel 11, replacing imperial Rome. And notice what it says in verse 31. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. That's a description of the Dark Age papacy. Because forces, the military forces of European nations would be used by the papacy to secure its power. It would take away the sanctuary, take away the daily, and put into effect the abomination of desolation. That's the papal power. Does that make sense? I've lost you all, didn't I? I haven't I? Go ahead.
Isn't that what Jesus also said in Matthew 24?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I thought verse 30 was interesting. It says, so if he shall return and show regard to those who forsake the holy covenant.
Yeah.
Basically, he's going with the people who are against
Yeah.
Christians.
Yeah, and you find out later in verses 32, 33, and 34 that he corrupts by flatteries. He tries to entice people to recant. And he uses intelligence from those people to go hunt down Christians because they gave up hiding places and where these people were hiding out. And papal armies would go and wipe them out.
That shows that heresy was in the church right at that point, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Before it looked like the Christians were being persecuted, and all of a sudden they're like allowing
Exactly. Yep.
to change them.
Yep. Exactly. You got it. So, forces would fight for the papacy to defile the sanctuary, take away the and set up the abomination of desolation. Now, there's basically two positions on the sanctuary, daily, and abomination of desolation. Some suggest the sanctuary is the city of Rome, and the daily is paganism, and the abomination of desolation is the papacy. The other position is that the sanctuary is the heavenly sanctuary. The daily is Christ's ministry in the sanctuary, which the papal power usurped by obscuring that, by pointing people to the church and to the pope and to the priest for salvation and not Christ, and that the abomination of desolation is still the papacy and could be like the mass. So there's different views. I don't debate what those terms represent other than this describes the Dark Age papacy, because you see these very same terms. These terms are also found in Daniel 8, 9 through 14, which discusses the medieval papacy, so they confirm that these details refer to papal Rome. Daniel 8, 9 through 14 uses these very same terms in reference to the papacy. Therefore, they must describe the papacy in this text for the sake of consistency, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? These are tough verses, aren't they? But you guys know what you're talking about now, right? This text signifies, and this is very important now too, this text signifies a hermeneutical shift from literal geographic powers to global symbolic powers. Now that we are into the papacy, is the papacy a geographic kingdom? You might argue that it's geographically centered in Rome, but the reality is that the papal power is a global spiritual kingdom, a worldwide power, right? So in my estimation, when we look at symbols from here on out in the chapter, for the sake of consistency, as also being global and symbolic, if that makes sense. And that'll get clearer, hopefully. Well, I said that last week, that it would get clearer this week, and I know that it has. So, we'll see. Let me see if there's any other. Okay. This means that all apocalyptic terms from this point forward in Daniel 11 must be understood as global symbolic powers and not literal geographic ones. All right? This principle is further supported by the fact that in verses 1 through 29, specific rulers of empires, as well as their activities, are mentioned. Yet in verses 30 to 45, we only see a discussion of general historical trends and not the activities of specific rulers, which is interesting. From this point forward, you don't see the specific activities of specific kings under specific empires like you did before. You see a more general exposition of general historical trends under the umbrella of an empire or kingdom, not necessarily specific rulers who acted in behalf of those empires. Does that make sense? Now, granted, this is a broader period of history, 1260-year Dark Ages. I mean, it would be hard for God to really unpack in a single chapter everything that happened. So going a general route, right? Let me see here. Okay, well, do you want to press pause on this and do 32 to 35 next week? Okay. Like I said earlier, I would probably handle this a little bit differently if I taught it again. Because going through all these verses, again, the challenge we have is when you look at all this phraseology in every verse, how do you safely find specific historical events that you know meet those details? It's very difficult, right? But I think, personally, this sounds kind of snobby, maybe, but I think we've been on pretty safe ground so far, up to this point. We might not be able to explain every little phrase up to this point, but we see some pretty significant phrases here and there that show us where we may be in the stream of time as far as history, right? Does that make sense? Okay. I think.
Well, verses 40 to 45 may entail some of that problem.
Yeah. Because those are the real juicy verses right there. Because those are where I believe they relate to our time now, and in the future. So, and I'm going to present some what I feel are safe speculations maybe about some of those verses, but we'll just have to see what happens. Any thoughts?
I think we're still trying to digest it.
There's a lot, and I started to put together an outline for tonight, and my computer crashed, so I'll have to have that for you next week. I apologize, but
I was going to ask you, the word sacrifices, was that in the original?
that's a supplied. Ellen White even said in early writings 74 and 75 that the word sacrifices is an inserted word. It should just say daily, which is the Hebrew word tamid, continual.
What does that mean?
Well, the perpetual, continual sacrifice, intercession, it relates to the ministry of the priest. And that's why some people have shifted from the view of the daily being paganism, and they've shifted to the daily being a reference to Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary in terms of intercession, because that word is used in the Old Testament, in Exodus and Leviticus, and in these Old Testament books, the Pentateuch, where Moses instituted the sanctuary services through God's leading, because that word is used in reference to the intercessory ministry of the priests. And since the papacy implemented a false system of salvation when it came to power that was based on a human intercession and not Christ's intercession, that institution of that false system of salvation obscured that ministry of Christ in heaven, took people's minds off of Christ and put them on the priest and the pope and the church as the means that you have to go through to be saved, and therefore spiritually took away the daily Christ's continual ministry.
But it did kind of both, didn't it?
Yeah.
Physically, Rome kind of fell away and papacy.
Yeah. Well, but here's the thing I think we have to understand, and I tell my paganism daily friends this, because there's evidence to support both views, in all fairness. Because Ellen White talked about how God gave the pioneers the correct view, and the pioneers all believed it was paganism. And then later on in Selected Messages, she said, don't use my writings to support any view of the daily. So, you have these two apparently contradictory comments, and I think we need to do some more study into it. But the point is that I believe the papacy did more to perpetuate paganism rather than destroy it. Because what it did is it took all these pagan teachings and it plugged them into the church instead of eradicating them. So there's some discussion on that. But I don't get into arguments. I have a very close friend who's an exceptional student of Daniel 11, and he's hardcore on paganism. And we talk about it, and he's like, listen, Mark, and in my thesis, when I wrote on that specific point, I just mentioned both views and cited some sources for each view and said, listen, either way,
It happened either way.
Yeah. Paganism was on its way out,
Yeah.
and the papacy was on its way up, and they obscured Christ's ministry.
Yeah.
So...
Christianity was changed as well.
Exactly. Yes.
But if you shift it,
Go ahead.
Okay, when Jesus was saying in Matthew's 24th chapter, the abomination of desolation, when he said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the place,
Well, I think you have to remember that in Matthew 24, Jesus is, I personally believe, weaving in three different periods together. First and foremost, he's talking about the literal destruction of Jerusalem, and the abomination of desolation is Rome. It's when Rome came under Titus and they leveled the city. But there's evidence when you compare Matthew with Mark 13 and Luke 21 with Revelation 11 verse 2, there's evidence to suggest that he's also talking about the papal power standing in the holy place, meaning the holy place being the church, spiritually, and the papacy standing as head of the church and bringing in desolating, abominable practices into the church during the Dark Ages.
That's what I was thinking.
But you also see a resurgence of that at the end of time when the deadly wound is healed.
Okay.
And the papacy will reemerge claiming to be head of the church once again, sitting in the temple of God, claiming that he is God, the temple being the church.
Is that First Thessalonians?
That's 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4. And you have, in my opinion, and I think I preached on this once, at least I made this point, you've got the king of the north entering the glorious land in Daniel 11:41. You've got the king of the north planting its authority in the glorious holy mountain in Daniel 11:45. You got the man of sin, son of perdition, sitting in the temple.
Yeah.
And you've got the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. So you've got king of the north, man of sin, son of perdition, abomination of desolation, all symbolizing the papacy. Then you've got the glorious land, glorious holy mountain, temple, and holy place, all symbolizing the church. So those are parallel statements, in my opinion. They're just described with different prophetic terms. Because God repeats and enlarges and repeats himself often in prophecy with different symbols, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Right? So that's how I see Matthew 24.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
I'll give it to
no, it's okay. Go ahead, Goldine. This isn't adding and subtracting tonight, Goldine. This is calculus, spiritual calculus, okay?
And I failed that.
No, as far as I'm concerned, you got an A right now in my class. Go ahead. That's why I don't know if I could ever be a really good professor, because I'd just be a pushover. Everybody take my class because they know I give out A's.
Oh, well, I take it. No, it was deviating from all in a straight line. You don't deviate from one to the other. If you stay straight, it all makes sense.
You think so? Yeah.
If you keep it
Yeah.
in the straight path, it will. But when you move over, then it begins to get confused.
Well, and here's the thing. That's why I see verses 30 to 31 as a hermeneutically important text. Because when you transition into the papacy, you're now on a spiritual level, a symbolic level. You're no longer dealing with kingdoms that are confined by geography. And the challenge that Uriah Smith had was, do you remain geographically literal through the whole prophecy? And people who promote the Turkey view stay literal and geographic through the whole vision.
But does it make sense?
I personally don't think it does, because when the papacy enters the picture, it's a whole new ballgame hermeneutically in terms of interpretation, because the papacy is a global symbolic kingdom. Therefore, the other symbols from that point forward have to be understood globally and spiritually as well, and are not confined to geography. Therefore, the king of the north is still the papacy, and it's the papacy from verse 30 to the end of the chapter. The king, at least in my opinion, the king of the south now becomes, it's still Egypt, but is it literal Egypt or is it symbolic Egypt? What does that symbolize? And when you get into verse 41, talks about the glorious land, talks about Edom, Moab, Ammon. Verse 42 talks about Egypt. Verse 43 talks about Egypt or Libya and Ethiopia. And verse 45 talks about the glorious holy mountain. Those are all geographic entities in the Old Testament. So are those literal geographic entities in that text? Or because the papacy transitions into a global spiritual concept, are those concepts now to be understood spiritually and globally as well? And if so, how do we identify a meaning for them? Those are challenges you have to face.
So we have to know that things have changed from literal to symbolic.
I think so. But see, some of my friends who I'm in dialogue with about the Turkey view feel it's literal and geographic through the whole prophecy, and it's a literal reading, and it should not be taken and spiritualized away. But I think we run into a challenge, because what is Israel now? What is Babylon now? What is the temple now? Are those literal? Well, in the Old Testament, Babylon was a literal kingdom. Israel was a little kingdom. The temple was literal. Mount Zion was literal. Well, in the New Testament, who's Babylon? Is that a literal kingdom?
But you made a transition.
Exactly. That's my point.
Spiritual.
Babylon is now a spiritual system of confusion. Israel is now the church. The temple on earth is now God's faithful people. Mount Zion. Psalm 125 verse 1 says, "For God's people will be as Mount Zion, which will be faithful and will never be moved." That's even in the Psalms. That's Old Testament still. See, God was already preparing the way for the spiritual understanding of these concepts. Now, how do we understand, for example, let's take the king of the south in verse 40 as being Egypt. How do we understand symbolic Egypt? Well, what we have to do is we have to look at ancient Egypt in the Old Testament and identify its temperament and disposition in terms of how it relates to God and His people. And I'm going to give you a little commercial. When you look at Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 5, when Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Listen, Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord God, let my people go, that they may offer a sacrifice to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh says, "I don't know, Lord. Who's the Lord? Neither am I going to let Israel go." Pharaoh just refused to acknowledge God's presence and prerogatives. Ellen White in Great Controversy 269 equates Egypt with a symbol of atheism. So, in my estimation, I personally see the king of the south in Daniel 11:40 as an atheistic power. And it talks about how at the time of the end, which is 1798, the king of the south pushes against the king of the north. That word push is the Hebrew word nagak, which means to gore with horns like a bull, to stampede. So the king of the south gores the king of the north at the time of the end in 1798. That's a deadly wound to the papacy in 1798. So what atheistic power did that? There you go. See, it's complicated, but it's really not. But what we have to do is we have to have a consistent set of principles in place to follow. And the problem with Adventism today when it comes to Daniel 11 is everyone's doing what's right in their own mind. You've got people saying that Islam's the king of the south. You've got people saying that literal Egypt's the king of the south. And you've got people like me who are saying that atheism is the king of the south. But what principles are they following? Those who espouse Islam are still tied to geography because, guess what? Modern day Egypt is Muslim. And you've got people who believe in the Turkey view saying, hey, these are literal geographic powers. And Napoleon fought against Turkey and Egypt back in the 19th century. So you've got a different set of principles for every interpretation. The problem is that interpreters do not agree on a set of principles to follow consistently. And that is why we have division on Daniel 11. Whereas if we got together and we said, listen, what does the Bible say about these interpretive principles? How do we interpret apocalyptic prophecy in this dispensation when Babylon and Israel are now spiritual and not literal geographic? And if we take Babylon and Israel as symbolic and spiritual and global and worldwide, why wouldn't these other symbols be viewed the same way? It's pretty simple, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm getting way ahead of myself. And I just spilled the beans on my view of the king of the south. But I will get more into that because that's important. That's important. And by the way, it says in the second part of verse 40 that the king of the north will respond to that push by re-emerging to power, like a whirlwind and with ships and with chariots and horses, and will enter into the countries and pass over. Evidently, Rome, the papacy the king of the north is going to respond from that deadly wound and emerge back to power. And some have said, well, Mark, How will the king of the north destroy atheism, the king of the south? Well, I think that when a power is conquered, it doesn't necessarily mean that that power is wiped off the map. When the papacy was given its deadly wound, did the papacy cease to exist as an institution?
No.
What happened? It lost civil power. But it still elected a pope the next year. After Pope Pius died the next year in exile, they still elected another pope, and ever since then they've been electing popes. So the papacy didn't cease to function as an institution. And in like manner, I don't think atheism is going to end in terms of an ideology.
What do you mean end? I mean, because,
Wiped out. No more atheism. No one's an atheist anymore.
oh,
Well, here's the thing, though. When will the deadly wound be healed? It didn't happen in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty, like a lot of people are saying.
What is that for the Pope?
When Rome regains civil power through Sunday laws, then the wound will be healed. And I believe that atheism will be conquered when atheistic people and nations submit to Sunday laws. And here's another thing to think about. Satan is going to counterfeit Christ's advent at some point. And I believe it will be after a national Sunday law, not before. I believe the Sunday law will be passed in the United States. Then Satan will appear as Christ. And that deception will be so monumental that all the nations around the world will follow suit. Let me ask you a question. When Satan appears as Christ and this deception just goes around the world, do you think there'll be an atheist left?
yeah, I won't. I mean, everything will be combined. I mean, you know.
Well, but here's the thing, though. Ellen White says that that Satan's counterfeit of Christ's coming is a universe. It is so monumental that the entire world will be swept up in the net of that deception. I believe every person, when that happens, will embrace Christianity. But the question is do you embrace Sabbath Christianity or Sunday Christianity?
That's when it's global. It's going
Yes.
to include everybody.
So, some things to think about. How it's going to happen specifically, I'm not putting my head in the guillotine and saying it's going to happen like this, this, and this, and this. But I think generally speaking, we can see these trends moving towards Sunday laws, which are the mark of the beast. All right? And when Satan counterfeits Christ's advent, it's going to sweep the whole world up. And I don't think, I think every atheist will say, man, well, I was wrong not to believe in God. Here's Christ. This miracle is just incredible. And I think atheists are going to be one. I mean, I say one loosely because they won't be one to the true faith, most of them. They'll be one to Christ in the sense that they'll embrace Sunday laws. But there's some things that are going to happen that we'll just have to wait and see how they're going to unfold specifically. But those are just some thoughts, and I'm getting way ahead of myself. And I should have approached this chapter a lot differently, so I apologize. Because we've gotten very technical about this, and I've kept you until 8:30.
We don't know if you got technical or not. We just know that.
Goldine's like, whoa. All right, any other questions before we close? Will you guys please come back next week? Because I think I think some of the 144,000 fell away. Well, we'll review 30 to 39, and then we'll try to nibble on 40 to 45 if we can. We may need another week to get through 40 to 45 because there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I like those verses. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, tonight we have gone through a lot of history. These verses in Daniel 11 are very, very thick with complicated phraseology, but Lord, we think we have at least a working knowledge of the general sequence of these verses. Lord, if nothing else, we see Rome enter the picture in verse 16 and at least go to verse 39. And then in verses 30 to 31, Lord, we see a transition into the papacy. And we at least can pick out some general points to where we can see a transition in empires. Lord, we pray that you'll help us to understand more deeply. And I know, Lord, that as we exercise our minds around these verses more and more, they become easier to understand. So we pray that you'll help us to understand these things And we ask now that as we leave that you'll be with us and keep us safe. And Lord, we pray, above all things, that you would help us to continue each and every day to be ready. Because we know that when the final events come, these movements will be rapid ones. And we want to be ready. Bless us now with safety as we travel home and watch over our families. Be with our church family as well, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.